I see no sign that people cannot hear me. I presume that you can all hear me. And so, yes, dear CETRA Chair Professor, dear Director, dear staff members, but above all, of course, dear participants, colleagues, and friends. It is really my pleasure to welcome you to this 34th CETRA Summer School. And I would like to take the opportunity to share some thoughts, no more than that, to share some thoughts with you in what I could call my double capacity. I mean by that, member of CETRA and Translation Studies Scholar, and also as a Vice Rector for Humanities and Social Sciences at KU Leuven. Let me start by the latter. KU Leuven is fully supportive, and I would really like to underline that KU Leuven is fully supportive of initiatives like CETRA, because we believe that summer or winter schools provide high achieving and ambitious students a transformative experience by combining challenging academic life with a culture of innovation, academic excellence, global responsibility, and so much more. At this moment, some 37 summer or winter schools are organized at KU Leuven, of which 13 in the field of humanities and social sciences. And they cover topics such as global challenges for our sustainable future, the sustainable development goals after COVID-19 pandemic, or summer school on the law, ethics, and policy of artificial intelligence. Just a few examples, of course. Moreover, KU Leuven doesn't stand alone in its support for this kind of initiatives, because since 2011, the Flemish government provides a special subsidy for the Flemish universities, among which KU Leuven, the so-called Support for Young Scholars subsidy, to support the training, career development, international orientation and collaboration of young researchers. And every year, thanks to this initiative, workshops, science slams, company visits, coachings and tutorials, junior mobility fellowships, summer schools are organized at KU Leuven, and KU Leuven is involved in many, I think it's more than 100 many inter-university initiatives, among which the Flemish Training Network for Methodology and Statistics, but also the summer school Let's Talk Science on science communications, with workshops, yes, on ChatGPT as a creative partner in science communication, but also on intercultural communication. Well, I think all these examples illustrate, as I have said already, that summer schools are not an isolated endeavor, but that they are, and that they should be, I think, embedded in research training, and that they are an important part of it. Among other things, this is because summer schools and winter schools, but I will only refer to summer schools here. So this is because summer schools have clear benefits, both for the participants and for the host university. We know from testimonies, but also from international research, that summer schools increase participants' self-confidence, give them the confidence to pursue their dreams, enhance their independent learning, and encourage them to discover their potential. So summer schools meet these complex needs by emphasizing skill development and stimulating curiosity, creativity, and self-reliance. Summer schools, moreover, encourage universities to critically self-reflect and to continuously improve and enhance their curriculum so as to meet the needs of current and prospective students, as well as those of the staff. And I think all that is very important. In other words, summer schools play, I think, an essential role in innovating doctoral training of the 21st century. And that, for me at least, is their most important role. Indeed, we all know that the world is less predictable than it used to be, or at least than we thought it to be. According to Fernando Reimers, who is International Education Faculty Director at Harvard University, half of the jobs that are going to be around 10 years from now have not yet been invented. And here obviously lies a big challenge for doctoral research and doctoral training. Indeed, doctoral graduates increasingly move at some point of their career from academia to the private or public sector. In the European Union, 49% of employment in research and development is in the private sector. 39% is in higher education, essentially in research universities, and 12% is in the public sector, for example, in national research laboratories. As a consequence, doctoral summer schools of the 21st century have the task to educate a new generation of global scientists and citizens prepared to create, to collaborate, and to navigate the world's complexities. According to recent research, the likely drivers of change in doctoral education over the next decades can be classified into three broad categories. First, changes in the contexts and sites where research is conducted and where research training is delivered. I think it's perhaps no coincidence that we alternate now within CETRA online and on-site editions. So changes in the context and the sites where research is done. Second, changes in how knowledge is produced, organized, distributed, and used. And three, changes in the demographic makeup of those who are pursuing or will pursue a research doctorate. And these are no little or no small things. The need to prepare a workforce of scientists and scholars who can work across national boundaries and in different settings, coupled with the great attention now being given to accountability and assessment, is generating increased attention to the desirability of teamwork, communication skills, intercultural or global awareness as important dimensions of doctoral training. And yet, there is much less agreement about which additional competences will characterize the most productive scholars and leaders of the coming century, or about how those future scholars and leaders might be best and most efficiently educated. What are precisely the cultural competences needed for effective work in teams composed of individuals from diverse disciplinary, racial, ethnic, religious, or national backgrounds? And what are precisely the new analytical, interpersonal, and communication strategies that doctoral graduates will need in order to have rewarding careers as knowledge increasingly comes to be held not by individuals, but by communities? Efforts to grapple with these issues at the level of the university and the global environment will shape doctoral education significantly over the remainder of the coming century or of this century, and probably beyond. And I think summer schools have an important role to play here, and I'm sure that CETRA is ready to take up this role. As much as forces external to the academy are driving change in the area of doctoral education, so too is the evolving nature of scholarship itself. Among the core competences that are part and parcel of the 21st century research doctorate, let me just give two examples, which I think, and that's important, are well presented in CETRA's program. First, competences related to interdisciplinarity, and as well in the program as in the projects, I think there is a lot of interdisciplinarity. We could talk long about that, but there is no time, of course, here. That will come later. So that was the first point. Second point, synthetic or inductive approaches to research. As research has shown that the focus increasingly shifts away from deductive or analytical modes of scholarship and science. And I refer here to, for instance, the workshops that are part of CETRA's program. Today's research indeed calls for attention to inter- or transdisciplinarity, and that is nothing new for you, and also multi-scalar issues. The complex challenges facing 21st century doctoral education require researchers who can collect and analyze information from multiple academic disciplines. Think of economics, biology, psychology, the arts, history, and more. And who can translate, of course, in a very different meaning, translate those findings into transformative ideas for policy reform and practice. complex problems at the interface of science and societies on a scale ranging from the local to the global are increasingly prominent and require not only issue-specific knowledge, but also, and increasingly, the ability to place one's investigations within a framework that acknowledges the multidimensional nature of research, the globally interconnected nature of the phenomena under investigation, and any locally relevant responses to recognizing and mediating the issues that constitute the areas of research. And for sure, I'm convinced that these developments also find and are finding their way in translation studies. And here I come to the second part of my short reflections, more from the viewpoint of a translation studies scholar. And I give only a few viewpoints here. In the current digital age, the advent of digital texts, including several types of media such as sounds, videos, hyperlinks, not only changes the nature of the text, as we know, but also its translation. Translating digital works that are implemented as computer programs takes, for instance, place both in code and language, drawing from the methodologies developed by code studies, platform studies, and expressive processing. And I'm referring here to publications, for instance, by Marecki and Montfort. Research on the translation of electronic texts also points to the need for a broader conceptual and methodological framework comprising at least 4 dimensions. The translinguistic dimension concerning translation between languages, which I think coincides more or less with the more traditional definition of translation, and there's nothing wrong with that. We still need that, of course. The transcoding dimension consists of translation from code to text or between codes. The transmedial dimension refers to translation between text, sound, and images. And then the transcreational dimension, referring to translation as a shared creative process. And I see developing and happening all that within translation studies, and I think that's a good thing. As a consequence, indeed, electronic texts translation serves as an additional constraint and pattern space for testing theories and practices of translation. And of course, this is what we all should do as scholars. A second reflection, the intersemiotic nature of digital texts furthermore urges translation study scholars to incorporate new forms of intersemiotic translation into their models. And this is, among others, a call that has been launched by Basnet and Johnston as part of their plea for an outward turn in translation studies. Now, we have had many turns, and I don't know if we need new terms, but this call, I think, is an important one. Recent publications on multimodality, on translation and contemporary art, on the experimental and experiential features of translation in relation to multimodal environments, or on intersemiotic translation from an interdisciplinary perspective, and this in dialogue with semiotics, with cognitive poetics, with psychoanalysis and much more, I think are responding to this call. I'm referring here to publications, among others, by Parlock, by Claramonte, by Lee, by Campbell and Vidal. If you are interested in references, I am happy to transfer them to you. Moreover, and I think here, although rather late in comparison to other fields, digital humanities methods increasingly find their way into research on translation and even literary translation. Already since the 2010 decade, Jan Rybicki and his team are pioneers in stylometry, which is a large-scale quantitative approach to study style in literary translation. I'm referring here to a publication, for instance, from 2021. Digital humanities approaches give ample possibility to be combined with computational social network analysis and give new insights, for instance, on global translation flows. I'm referring here to publications, among others, by Diana Roux-Sans, who is part of our staff here, or on poetry translation. Interesting work being done by Luca Tănăsescu, for instance, While machine translation has long been regarded as only suited to translate text characterized by highly formulaic or repetitive constructions, the advent of neural machine networks, as we know, has opened new possibilities. And since the first computer-assisted literary translation workshop was organized in 2019, interest in the subject is high and growing rapidly, and this not only among machine translation scholars, who of course are keen to push the boundaries of what is technically possible, but it's also growing among literary translation specialists who are, and rightly so, keen to assess the effects of the advancing technology on text and readers. And this synthesis, I think, is bringing about new ways of researching translation for both parties. And a very interesting publication among others, once again, is by Hadley, Taivalkovsky-Shilov, Teixeira, and Torrell, 2022. As for now, I think empirical studies still show that human translation remains the most creative and that the neural machine translation system trained on literary data does not have the necessary capabilities for a creative translation. That is at least the viewpoint that Guerberov, Arenas, and Toral express in a publication from 2022. This might, however, soon change. Who knows? Not only technology-driven evolutions, but also the recent change in the status of humans have profound implications for translation as a human or as a partly human activity. Of course, as you all know, for the first time in history, we live in an epoch, the so-called Anthropocene, in which humans have a substantial and potentially destroying impact on the Earth's climate and ecosystems. Human-induced climate change brings the fundamental relations between humans and non-humans to the fore. Consequently, eco-translation, that is, in Michael Cronin's definition, all forms of translation thinking and practice that knowingly engage with the challenges of human-induced environmental change, end of quote, end of the definition. So eco-translation makes us aware of the fundamental role of translation in the survival of the Earth. Applied to translation, eco-translation would, for instance, give minorities agency in terms of what, when, and how texts, among others literary texts, might be translated into or out of their languages. More in general, I think, eco-translation asks fundamental questions about the interdependencies that make up the context of translation and that have profound implications on who pays attention to translation and why, and what has ecology got to do with the attentionscape of the contemporary moment. These are questions that Michael Cronin asks in a 2019 publication. The above-mentioned developments have led to a gradual questioning of the anthropocentric and linguicentric biases in the study of translation. And this questioning is inspired by biosemiotics, referring here, among others, once again, to the works of Cobus Marais. So biosemiotics that conceptualize translation within an expanded definition of translation as a semiotic process taking place in and between all living organisms, human and non-human alike. It is also inspired by complexity theory, conceptualizing translation as a complex, unpredictable process and overcoming the binaries, of course, that have been sought to be overcome for many years now in translation studies, but rightfully so. And altogether, I think, they enable to understand translation as part of the interconnectedness in the Anthropocene and to introduce the study of translation into the 21st century. I come here to my conclusion because I have no doubt that all these elements and so much more are part of the 34th edition of the CETRA Summer School with its promising participants. I must say that I was really very interested by all the projects that I've read. So promising participants, internationally renowned staff, and above all, of course, its 34th chair professor, because I think many of these things are being tackled by Hanna Risku in her lectures. And I refer here to the first lecture that she will be giving today, and you have read, I'm sure, on the website, that in this lecture, she is tackling the role of the social and material world for translation, stressing that translation is not only a mental process inside the translator's brain, but that the body is also an integral part of translation, as are social and physical interactions and the use of various tools. The object of study, you've found all that on the website, the object of study is thus extended from individual translators and their cognitive processes to a coupled system of human organisms and other entities. And I think that's very important, and I'm very much looking forward to that lecture. And so, therefore, it is my pleasure once again to welcome each and every member of the CETRA class of 2023 and to officially declare the CETRA Research Summer School in Translation Studies open. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Hanna Risku. I should clap. This is when we would all clap together. Many, many thanks for your insightful reflections on the future of translation studies research in the digital age, and also for contextualizing CETRA as a summer school, among many others, so well. Professor Risku is the Vice Rector for Humanities and Social Sciences at the KU Leuven, but I might add that she was also CETRA's director from 2006 to 2014. So it's very special that you opened our summer school. Thank you. Dear participants, dear colleagues and visitors, on behalf of CETRA, it's also my pleasure to welcome you. Thank you for being here today to attend the academic opening session of our summer school, the 34th edition, a session which features, first and foremost, our chair professor, Hanna Risku, who will be delivering the first of 5 CETRA chair lectures today. We'll hear more from the chair professor, and I'll also introduce her in a minute, but I'd also just like to pause to take a moment to celebrate for the 34th time the beginning of CETRA Research Summer School in Translation Studies. You might not know who I am. My name is Jack McMartin. I took over the reins of CETRA last October, following in the footsteps of the ever-poised, ever-wise, a distinguished colleague, Peter Boulogne. I'd like to thank Peter also for his generosity during the transition and for sharing his time and expertise and experience so generously. And also to thank him for 4 years of leadership in difficult years through the pandemic. Peter should also be applauded for other achievements, including fostering a truly cooperative culture among CETRA and the wider CETRA community during his tenure. My feeling is that he boosted our sense of togetherness in a very difficult and tenuous moment, and among other things through the online presence of CETRA. As you know, this is the 3rd time that CETRA is being held online, but it's also thanks to Peter that CETRA has its blog, a lot of lovely alumni testimonials, its social media accounts, and so on. So it was a vital achievement at a vital moment to keep the CETRA community connected. This is my first time as the organizer of CETRA Summer School, but it's not my first CETRA Summer School. I attended CETRA 8 years ago as a participant when Professor Judy Wakabayashi was the chair professor, and I remember being very excited. I also remember a bit of the dread or the uncertainty that I felt at that time, and that I'm sure some of our participants are currently feeling on the front end of my CETRA experience. So that was day 1 before we had gotten started. But what I will remember most from my CETRA experience was what happened after that, and the warmth with which the CETRA teaching staff embraced me and my other colleagues. It's also the first time I called myself a colleague, and also my project. So it was it was a first encounter of being taken seriously. It was the first true challenge to my thinking and to the limits that I had placed for myself and for my project. And it helped me see unseen assumptions that I made, and also gave me a forum to fall on my face, to really fail, but to do so gracefully and in the full confidence that I could get up again and move forward and move the project forward. So that's why I call it a transformative experience. The CETRA effect is sometimes evoked. And for me, it came at an important pivotal time. In fact, I would say that it was the pivotal moment in my early academic career that had it not happened, I certainly wouldn't be sitting here. It's also a first encounter with the remarkable community that is the translation studies field. I remember the first experience of being of actually feeling starstruck in my life. I had never felt that feeling until I watched Andrew Chesterman sparring with Daniel Gilles about a certain methodological question. This played out in front of our eyes, etc. It was like watching a heavyweight boxing match. And I remember, and that, that's exactly what this is about. I mean, not that we're violent or anything, but that we are engaging in true academic discourse. So it's also an honor now for me to be able to contribute to your CETRA experience, and I'm speaking to the CETRA class of 2023 now as one of CETRA's organizers. And I really, truly wish you each your own transformative experience. I'm proud to be the first to also welcome you into the CETRA community. CETRA's core business is its summer school, but we also have other activities throughout the year, a series of lectures, which you are very welcome to follow on the website and the blog. In this past academic year, CETRA has hosted 2 CETRA lectures in collaboration with a partner center here at the University of Leuven, the Center for Reception Studies. So our fall lecture was delivered by Olaleka Paul with the title From the Translator's Fingers to the Reader's Eyes, Empirical Research into How Readers Process Translated Texts. Spring lecture was given by Emily Apter, entitled Translating Injustice, the Problem of Speech on Freedom in Claudia Ranke's Just Us. CETRA also has a book series which was launched in 2019. It has the title Translation, Interpreting, and Transfer, the CETRA series. Its founding editors, also members of the teaching staff, are Luc van Dorselaar and Heidi Kotze. And this year they passed on the editorship to Sara Ramos Pinto, who's here present, and to myself. This is a series that's in transition, but we are fully committed to offering the series open access in a dynamic digital format. We've published 7 volumes so far. There's several more in the pipeline. We publish monographs and edited volumes from established researchers, but also welcome proposals from PhD candidates and early career researchers, including English translations of PhD theses in other languages. We also publish, by tradition, a yearly edited volume of CETRA papers. And that taps into also a strong commitment to provide, Professor Melaerts was talking about the other types of skills that we need to train researchers in, and one of them is editorial capacities. So to be able to edit a book, but also to participate in peer review and so on. And so part of the CETRA book series mission is to offer participants of the summer school expertise or an experience as book editors and peer reviewers. So that happens in concert with the CETRA teaching staff, who co-review submissions together and provide editorial advice. The core business of CETRA, as I mentioned, is and remains the summer school, which is the brainchild, I might say, of our respected colleague who's here as well, Professor Emeritus José Lambert. José is also the founder of CETRA and invented the summer school as a way to promote research training in the study of translational phenomena long ago, before that was a thing, a true invention. So ever since, the summer school has been organized on a yearly basis with one hiatus due to the pandemic in 2020. This is our third summer school online. After a long period of reflection, the CETRA board and its steering committee, together with its CETRA teaching staff, took the decision to offer the CETRA Research Summer School in both online and on-campus editions. This year were held online, but it will be followed next year by an on-campus summer school in 2024, and will continue to alternate between the two formats on a yearly basis. And this is us acting on ambition to counter the climate crisis and to expand access to the summer school for translation scholars, irrespective of their geographic, institutional, or economic situation. Today we embark on the 2023 summer school with 25 participants, 25 excellent participants, very promising translation studies scholars with very interesting topics and projects dealing with a large variety of different research topics. We're going to see subtitling, translation evaluation, screen adaptation, machine translation, AI, interpreting, news translation, translator studies, literary translation, gender studies, imagology, and the list goes on. And as it's clear from that list, we at CETRA embrace and advocate an open, a wide view of translation and translation studies research, as Professor Meelaerts also already indicated. And even if we're not dealing with exactly the same topics as a group, there's much to learn from each other. I'm really looking forward to finding the hidden connections that always emerge in these types of contexts. The variety of our participants also applies to their geographic backgrounds. This year we welcome participants from universities from 12 different countries. This year we received more applications than ever before for the summer school, making it also the most competitive cohort we've ever seen. And each and every one of those participants has taken the effort to apply for the summer school, to think carefully about their projects in doing so. And we would just also like to acknowledge that we made difficult decisions and turned away many qualified people who may be listening in right now. Your work is also acknowledged. Dear participants, now that you're here, we hope that you'll also be able to get the most out of your experience through the webinars, the tutorials, the workshops, the library work, and the presentations, but also in the non-official activities in the breakout rooms and on your own time together. We hope that your participation in the summer school will help you to shape and refine your research project, that you shake off some doubts, but maybe also find and identify some new doubts to work through. And we hope that your participation will empower you to engage in scholarly debates about translation as you move your career and your life forward. We cannot guarantee that this will happen, but we will promise that we'll try to make it possible together with you. And when I say we, I mean a bunch of people I'd like to thank for their contributions and efforts to the summer school. Let me begin by naming the teaching staff members who will be giving webinars, Q&A sessions, and tutorials. Geert Bronne, Anton Cox, Dilek Diesdag, Lieve de Hulst, Peter Flynn, Paula Gentile, Deborah Giustini, Inge Lanslots, Francis Mus, Frans Poacher, Sarah Ramos Pinto, Ayla Rigaud Terrein, Diana Roy-Sans, Beatrice van Akker, Jeroen van Dalen, Piet van Poeken. I'd also like to acknowledge the board members of CETRA, who are also members of the teaching staff: Pieter Boulogne, Elke Brems, Dirk de la Bastita, Reine Meelaerts, Heidi Salaerts, Luc van Doorselaar. And of course, the most important contributions to this year's summer school will be delivered by Hanna Risku, the 2023 CETRA chair. Her internationally recognized expertise and the broad research profile in the field of translation studies, and more particularly her explorations of the cognitive scientific foundations of translation, translation networks, ethnographic field research, and translation as computer-supported cooperative work, were considered by our advisory board and our board as valuable assets. That's also why you're here, Hanna. Hanna Risku is Professor of Translation Studies and the head of the research group's Socio-cognitive Translation Studies, Socio-trans, at the University of Vienna in Austria. Her research areas include translation and situated cognition, ethnography, translation workplace and network research, and translation expertise. Prior to her work in Vienna, she was Professor of Translation Studies at the University of Graz, Professor of Applied Cognitive Science and Technical Communication, Head of the Department for Knowledge and Communication Management, and Vice Rector at the Danube University Krems, Guest Professor at the University of Aarhus, Denmark, and lecturer at different universities in Austria, Finland, and Sweden. Professor Risku served as co-editor of Fachsprache, International Journal of Specialized Communication, and as president of the European Umbrella Organization for Technical Communication, TC Europe. In 2010, she was awarded the TC Europe Award for Services to Technical Communication in Europe, and she was elected to the Finnish Academy of Sciences in 2016. Hanna, I have the honor to hereby officially name you the chair professor of the CETRA Summer School 2023. Congratulations. We're very happy that you're here and that you accepted our invitation. We look forward to 2 weeks together. Apart from today's lecture, Hanna Risku will hold 4 public lectures, which are all freely accessible for any interested colleagues and visitors. The titles of those talks are Distributed Translatorship, a comparison of individualized, situated, and extended agency, which will be held tomorrow morning. Field Research and Translation Studies, the challenging journey of doing research in the workplace, on Thursday. Rethinking Translation Expertise, Lived Practice and Social Construction, next Monday morning. And finally, Practitioner and Employer Views on Translation Expertise, Insights from Ongoing Empirical Research, next Wednesday. So I invite you all warmly to attend those lectures, and you can see the abstracts on the website and in the program brochure. I should certainly not forget to thank our dear colleague, Steve de Wallace, who is the administrative coordinator of CETRA. As I've said it before, and it should never be forgotten, CETRA directors come and go, but Stephen remains the backbone of this center, and we couldn't organize the summer school without him. I would also like to thank the administrative technical staff members. I hope we won't need them all that much during the summer school. And finally, I'd like to respectfully mention the members of our steering board who have contributed to this edition through their advice and expertise from a distance. That's Tom Daams, Benjamin de Messel, Raphael Ingelbeen, Michael Oppenhoffen, Brigitte Schoenmakers, Tom Toremans, Tim van de Kruis, Pierre van Hekke, and Heidi Verplaatsen. I haven't yet thanked you, Hanna, for being here today. Thank you very much for being here today, for opening our summer school with the official CETRA opening lecture, to which we are all looking forward to. It is entitled Socio-cognitive Translation Studies and the Situatedness of Translation. We're dying to know, Hanna, what is our situation? The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jack. Thank you. Let me share the screen with you. So there you go. Okay, so I would like to also thank the board of the summer school for inviting me this summer, and thank you all for being here today. Thanks also from my side to the GATE organization team of the school, and of course to the team of professors and participants, supervisors. It's really a wonderful work that you are doing here for the next generation translation studies scholars. And dear summer school participants, congratulations for having been chosen to participate this year. I've read all your concepts that you wrote some months ago, and I think they're really coherent, very diverse topics, as it was mentioned. And yeah, I'm just really proud to be able to participate in an event like this. It's an honor. Thank you. Yes, about socio-cognitive translation studies. So in this first lecture, I would like to introduce you to the potential of a socio-cognitive approach in translation studies. And this perspective combines these two specific perspectives, the sociological perspective and the cognitive perspective to translation studies, because it assumes that social elements and environmental elements, they are integral parts of the cognitive process, the socio-cognitive process. So just as a very short introduction, examples for social elements are things like colleagues' expectations, company policies, willingness to belong to a team. Environmental elements include elements such as tools and information sources, of course. So the socio-cognitive approach deals with the role and importance of situation and context, this situatedness of translation. And I think it contributes to answering to some far-reaching questions in translation and also interpreting studies, even though I come from the translation side. And these questions and the contribution of the socio-cognitive approach are the topic of my lecture today. Let me first just explain what I mean when I talk about cognition. Our understanding of cognition depends on where in the world and how we assume cognitive processes to take place. So in general, I would contend that today, cognition is mostly understood as the elements and processes that enable intelligent activity, including emotional and motivational factors, and conscious and unconscious processes. And understanding of cognition is a prerequisite for explaining many of the activities relevant in translation and interpreting, like reading, writing, understanding, researching, because these are based on thinking, learning, and I will not be able to answer all these questions today, but I would still like to just brainstorm first on possible questions that in translation studies that do have to do with cognition. For example, why do translators find some things easy to translate, yet others they find difficult? What are the effects of different methods of teaching and learning on translation processes? How do translators assign meaning to target situation and to target texts and to source situations and texts? And are there any universal elements to thought processes that serve as a basis for translation, which remain the same across different cultures and languages and levels of training, degrees of experience, types of text that you work on, and so on? Can machine translation programs show us how human translators work, or can they only show us how people do not work? Is the post-editing of machine-translated text cognitively more or less demanding or effortful than translation? And of course, I have to add the more applied research that can address, for example, the following questions. What can be done in the production process to make translations understandable? What kind of tools support translators in their work? What kind of tools hinder in their work? And how good translators organize their work so that their task organization supports their well-being. So these are examples for questions that have to do with translation and cognition. And since the 1980s, one major strand of translation research increasingly turned to investigating translation processes from cognitive, psychological, and behavioral perspectives. And this branch has become to be known as translation process research. The focus in translation process research is on the production rather than reception processes, or at least it has been that. And this reorientation of translation studies towards functionalist and descriptive approaches in the late 1970s, for example, by Hans Vermeer, Justa Holtz-Manteri, Mary Snell Hornby, Gideon Turey, and others, they prepared the ground for the birth of translation process research. So in contrast to the linguistic, at that time, very equivalence-oriented approaches to translation that placed comparative studies on linguistic structures at the center of translation research, functionalist and descriptive approaches treated translation as a situated and culture-specific act undertaken by individual translators working with historically located networks of clients, sponsors, writers, and so on, and readers. So this shift in perspective was an important factor for process research because it placed translators or interpreters and their actors at the center of the translation agenda, the research agenda of translation studies. So translators were no longer depicted as ideally masters of objective linguistic knowledge, but as creative decision makers who strive to find solutions and produce adequate text for the situation at hand. And in this process, they produce a translation that is likely to look different if it were written by another translator for another client at another time and in another place. So these functionalist and descriptive approaches to translation generated interest in researching what happens during translation rather than focusing on the final product. And Holmes' well-known map of translation studies places research on translation processes under the descriptive branch of the discipline. So in line with this conceptualization, translation process research main concern since the 1980s has been to empirically observe and systematically document translation processes as they are carried out by lay people, students, professionals, and so on, either in the laboratory, in classrooms, and increasingly also in the field. And of course, all behavioral phenomena can provide valuable information on the cognitive process documented by this branch of research. For example, keystrokes, corrections, chats, web searches, switches in attention, adaptations of translation memory matches, breaks, and bursts of writing. And pioneering work on the translation process was undertaken by Krings, Gerloff, Wills, Siginov, Löscher, and also later on by Danks and others, myself, Tirkkonen, Kondit, and Jääskeläinen, and others. What distinguishes translation process research from other strands of translation research is its preference for empirical data and hard evidence. Rather than employing traditional humanities research methods such as historical and textual analysis, translation process research usually carries out research that involves observing translators while they are translating. So to this end, it draws on a range of methods that include think-aloud protocols, eye tracking, keystroke logging, screen recording, neurological measurements, and also participant and ethnographic observation. These are often combined with interviews, either retrospective interviews undertaken directly after observation of the translation process or interpreting process, or standalone qualitative interviews. There is a consensus, I think, among translation process research scholars that product analysis cannot reveal the underlying process, but still the textual material, such as final translations, drafts of translations, and so on, they often serve as additional sources of data, also as do artifacts and translation technology and other tools. Translation process research initially focused very extensively on developing methods and carrying out innovating experimental laboratory research. And theory and conceptual development often took second place, but with time, process researchers also began to relate their research designs and results to specific theories and develop concepts that are formulated on the basis of these empirical findings, and also to harmonize their use of terms and provide common frames of reference. So various scholars have increasingly called for translation process research to engage with insights from cognitive scientific research, for instance, in this area of situatedness of cognition. And at the same time, qualitative field research like cognitive ethnographies gained momentum in order to obtain rich descriptions of specific translation settings and processes. And these workplace studies, for example, that I'm engaged in, they do not aim at generalizability or transferability to other settings, but rather to increase our understanding of possible dynamics in authentic translation contexts. They aim to increase the relevance of translation research also for understanding translation practice in the field. And my third lecture at the summer school will tackle with this field of research in translation studies, this field research. And in my fifth lecture, I will discuss some insights, current insights from our field research that we are carrying out right at this moment in a project of ours. Cognitive scientific approaches to translation try to understand and explain the workings of translators' minds. How do translators and the other actors involved in translation create meaning in the situations and texts they handle? How do they arrive at their choices? How does their cultural and linguistic background influence their thinking and understanding? How do they learn and develop translation expertise? So the main goal of cognitive scientific approaches in translation is to explain the development and workings of the underlying processes that make the complex cognitive task of translation possible. And this is why and maybe how cognitive approaches differ from some other approaches to translation, such as linguistic or psychological approaches. What makes cognitive translation research cognitive is the fact that it tries to look behind the observable processes, and when doing so, it refers to certain cognitive scientific concepts or approaches as a framework. Cognitive processes like understanding and learning are neither visible nor self-evident, and there are several competing hypotheses in cognitive science regarding the meaning of neurological and behavioral evidence. One question, for example, that remains open is the location of meaning. Does meaning reside in words, in languages, in texts, maybe neuronal patterns, brains, in individuals, or in the social interaction, or in the interplay between some or all of these factors? So consequently, the different cognitive scientific approaches propose different answers to the question of what happens in the minds of translators. Technological innovations often serve as metaphors or inspiration for new scientific models. For example, the development of the models used in cognitive approaches to translation has been oriented, first of all, on the computer metaphor since the 1960s. That's when you see translation as information processing, symbol manipulation, code switching. The second turn would be starting somewhere in the 1980s, more dominantly, looking at the neural networks and in using the neuronal network metaphor. This applies to the connectionist models of translation and translation as an experiential, cultural act. And actually, many of the neural machine translation programs, of course, they use neural networks as the model, the neural machine translation. And since the 1990s in cognitive science, there has been the social networks metaphor, relying on embodied, embedded, extended, enacted, and affective cognitive approaches, or 4EA cognition, as it is also called, looking at or developing social constructivist models of translation and translation as situated socio-cognitive interaction and extended translation. Just a short background on this cognitive scientific background or theories, models, orientations rather, because they are not specific models or theories, but rather clusters of different orientations. So in the 1980s, the cognitive sciences experienced growing criticism of the computer metaphor or the symbol systems and information processing hypothesis. This model proved to be too simplistic. Sense and meaning cannot be primarily or exclusively explained as the decoding of symbols. For example, traditional algorithms might outperform the logical and mathematical calculation abilities of the human brain, but they have problems with dealing with incomplete information, with changes in the task or the system, with deviations from the rule, and tasks encountered in the so-called natural world. But of course, we humans, we are able to master and understand even incomplete and grammatically or structurally incorrect information with apparent ease if needed. And humans can relate information to their experience with the world. And to replace the computer metaphor, the 1980s marked the birth of the neural network metaphor and the connectionist models. And in the 1990s, there was this growing dissatisfaction again with the connectionist models because of their low priority that they accorded to the social and artifact mediated aspects of intelligence. So parallel developments in different disciplines acknowledge the importance of social and physical interaction in cognition, from developmental psychology to learning theories, robotics. I think robotics is extremely important here and interesting. Also dynamic systems theory and human-computer interaction. So consequently, scholars combined their efforts to tackle this socio-cultural situatedness of cognition, marking the birth of a new approach, the 4EA cognition, embodied, embedded, extended, enacted, and affective cognition. And I would like to also add distributed cognition here. So rather than explaining cognition as the recognition, reconstruction, and use of relatively stable schemes and patterns in the brain, as it is the case in the neural network metaphor, and it has its roots in, for example, Piaget's developmental psychology. These situated and embodied cognition views see cognition as agent-environment interaction in a psychosocial ecological system. We have ecology here again, with roots in Vygotsky's theory of language and thinking. And here, cognition is seen as situated interaction in complex physical and social situations, and not really as kind of the recycling and reuse of prior knowledge. So it's not in that case, in that sense, a knowledge-based view anymore. When adopting a view of cognition as embodied, embedded, extended, enacted, and affective for EA and distributed cognition, we assume that people cannot borrow meaning from their inherent cognitive abilities or from their environment or from other people. So meaning cannot be localized on paper or in the brain. It results from our interaction with our current environment. So this object of study is extended from the brain to its interaction with the body and the environment, emphasizing this importance of social interaction and interaction with cultural artifacts. Process research in translation has concentrated to a large extent on describing translation as a problem-solving and decision-making process. And the focus has been placed on those phases in which the translator faces difficulties, in which the translation process becomes slow and the translator tries to find a solution for a really problematic text segment, for example. By doing so, it has implicitly adopted an information processing view on translation. It looks at translation as a mental operation on internal processing units, and it defines a multitude of different mental process operators, such as macro strategies, micro strategies, techniques, methods, procedures, and so on. However, as Ricardo Munoz Martin points out, if we take the consequences of 4EA cognition seriously, unproblematic text segments and unconscious processes are just as interesting as problematic segments. They provide information on the ability to interact fluently with the material at hand, and thus they provide very relevant, they prove very relevant for the description of translation processes. And also affective and emotional aspects shift into the focus of translation research, and their impact is also increasingly being investigated. I personally call this approach, also in my publications, extended translation, in reference to the extended cognition approach developed by Clark and Chalmers. Extended translation, as my socio-cognitive approach to translational action, addresses questions regarding this embodied, embedded, extended, enacted, and affective aspects, the 4EA aspects and distributed aspects of translation. And I rely on the 4EA approach as a cognitive scientific framework, which emerged in 1990s. And this 4EA approach implies that material, social, neural, physical, cultural aspects of a situation are elements of the cognitive process. They are coupled with each other and they co-determine each other. So structures of the environments, or rather perceived structures of the environment or environmental affordances, are included in cognitive processes. They are included in the processes of remembering, of organizing ourselves and organizing others, making decisions, evaluating our own decisions and others' decisions, and so on. The 4EA cognition approach criticizes disembodied, decontextualized propositional theories of the mind. It offers an kind of an alternative culturally and historically embedded view of cognition, and it stresses the fact that human cognition leans strongly on and depends on the structures of the environment and the body. Even our understanding of abstract concepts is molded by our physical interactions with the world. So this way, exploiting and creating relatively stable environmental structures and bodily routines provide a consistency that supports the dynamic cognitive activity. In the next part of my today's talk, I will discuss the big questions that can be dealt with by adopting socio-cognitive approaches to translation. Socio-cognitive approaches to translation are motivated by the big question of how to define, describe, explain, understand, and influence translation-relevant processes. If cognitive processes are embedded in and dependent on the contexts and cultures, how much of these contexts and cultures are to be taken into account in our empirical studies, and what role do they play? What role does the contextual, social, and material embeddedness play in translation? How can we describe and understand translation-relevant processes beyond the brain and the individual? And what consequences does the distributed dynamic understanding of the process bring for the understanding of the product of translation and the characteristics and reception and use and impact of translations? To take the situational or situated and social embeddedness of translation processes into account in our empirical research, we need an extension of the object of research for the fields of translation process research and cognitive translation studies on several levels or dimensions. First, translating is not only a mental process inside the translator's brain. The body is an integral part of translation, as are social and physical interactions and the use of various tools. The cognitive process extends beyond an individual brain. Second, translation processes are taken to extend beyond the individual translator, and they encompass various other factors and artifacts. So the object of study is extended from individual translators to a coupled system of human organisms and other entities. And third, the translation process extends in time beyond the instance in which a given source text is available and read, and a translator starts to produce a target item, a target text item. Rather, the translation process begins much earlier when social and technical infrastructure for translation is built up. And the translation process does not end when a translation is completed, but continues with various quality checkups and revisions and maintaining the tools, the infrastructure. And as a fourth point, we need to carry out empirical research that looks at entire translation projects. And that requires extended periods of data acquisition, maybe a few days, often many weeks. And when you want to look at the development of the cognitive challenges in translation, then the research might need to span several years, at least months. So translators are not only working on immediate tasks, but also constantly taking care of building up and maintaining such long-term material, technical, and social infrastructure. So in that sense, I extend our understanding of the translation process on several levels, from the brain to the whole individual, from the individual to the context of activity, from a micro level processing of an individual text to the management and creation of whole translation projects and their products, and from individual translation projects to the dynamics of the socio-cognitive challenges in the field of translation. The overarching question of how to understand translation-relevant processes sparks further related questions. For example, we need to ask, what are the forces that structure or regulate or shape translation as an intelligent activity? Are the translation processes structured by linguistic regularities, wherever these regularities are located? Are they structured by explicit strategies? They might be ad hoc strategies, learned strategies, or provided by somebody else. Maybe social norms and conventions, or are they structured by internal mental patterns? And is it possible to keep the social and the cognitive together and define translation as a socio-cognitive object of research? I'm not talking here of adopting both social practices and cognitive processes as separate analytical categories, because in that case, you would still keep them apart. And you would, for example, weigh these factors up against each other. I'm trying to find a way to really keep them together and see them as one single unit of analysis, the socio-cognitive translation process. Because I think the one cannot be explained without the other. The social parameters and the effects of the networks cannot be explained without the cognitive dynamics and the effects of the individual actors, and vice versa. So social practices and cognitive processes meet halfway in newer conceptual understandings. Sociological and cognitive approaches in translation studies are converging, which I find extremely interesting. The sociological orientations are according more relevance to individual decision-making, and the cognitive orientations likewise recognize the importance of the social. For example, to mention some concrete research here, in her empirical research, Maureen Ehrensberger-Dow recognized that translators' decisions in the field are influenced by social expectations and hierarchical relationships and the respective organizational culture. So the decision-making of translators is not predetermined solely by the source text or by learned translation strategies. It's influenced to a large extent by social factors. And this has also consequences to our understanding of translation quality. The quality of a translated text cannot be sufficiently explained by focusing on a translator's choices and experience or skill or cognitive load alone or exclusively. Christina Abdallah calls for the pressures that translators face in the workplace to be incorporated in the ongoing debate on translation quality. Translation quality can only be understood when it is framed in a context that does not only include product quality, but also extend to the quality of the process and the social quality of translation environment. Also, in a similar vein, Kaisa Koskinen draws our attention to the affective side of translation and interpreting, taking both individual and social aspects into account. And again, Maureen Ehrensberger-Dow and her colleagues maintained an ergonomic research, the study of translators' well-being, should consider not only the physical and psychological aspects, but also the social aspects of a workplace. And Heidi Coetzee refers to the mutual embeddedness of functions, processes, products, and she describes translation, I quote, as both systems and processes that is shaped by the interplay between its individual and its social existence, unquote. So all these insights illustrate what Sari Hokkanen and Kaisa Koskinen stress, namely that, quote, researchers interested in translators' cognitive processes and those studying translation as a socio-historical contextualized activity have increasingly found themselves on shared ground. End of quote. So what are the forces that structure translation as an intelligent activity? To answer this really difficult question, I modeled this extended translation approach as a socio-cognitive research agenda in collaboration with my colleagues Matthias Apfelthaler and Florian Windhager. That was not 2013. And for illustration purposes, we developed this translatorial cognition and action model that you see here. The model includes these aspects that we think structure translation processes and need to be considered in empirical translation research. That would be cognition, including embodiment and emotions, action, the structure of the social network, relevant artifacts, outer environments, and of course, time. And boundaries between these factors here in the model, of course, are only drawn for analytical and methodological purposes, because what we want to say is that they belong together. To give you some examples of how this approach enables empirical research, in 2001, I carried out a fieldwork in a translation agency to observe the cognitive processes of the translators, project managers, and CEOs who worked there. And I realized that their work consists of many cognitive tasks that had not really been focused on in translation process research. That was tasks like project management, quality control, managing the network of freelance translators, and working with technology, of course. So it was actually the use of extended and the socio-cognitive approach that helped me understand how the cognitive process was distributed in this network, and that it in fact consisted of all the interactions running in parallel. So since then, I have carried out 3 follow-up studies in the same translation agency. So in a way, it's a longitudinal study spanning a total of 22 years in a translation agency. Later, I observed and interviewed a freelance translator working directly with the customer. And it was interesting to uncover the complex social network both on the customers and the translators' sides, and how that network shaped and scaffolded the translation process. Because sometimes you think if it's a translator and a client, well, it's only 2 people, but if you look at it more closely, you really reveal complex networks on both sides. And also in one of our studies, the empirical part consisted of a workplace study in a translation department of a public service institution. And there we studied emotional aspects and creativity with the translation, within the translation process, while trying to consider also the social embeddedness of translation in their working environment. Because I think it is important to study affect and creativity from the socio-cognitive perspective, and not only as individual traits. What would be then the most important, or some of the most important theoretical concepts that this perspective provides to translation studies? One of the main theoretical consequences is certainly the renewed emphasis on the good old concept of context, but maybe in a somewhat different understanding. Context can, of course, refer to all shapes and sizes of the surrounding material and social environment and text. From a cognitive point of view, we need to get away, however, from the container-like connotation of the term context. We need to avoid the misunderstanding that the context would somehow automatically and universally, prior to an action and independently of who is acting and why this person is acting, that the context would structure the action itself. Because the circumstances of action are also in the process of being perceived and understood in situ during the action itself. So if something happens in this and that context, it means that it happens in relation to relevant elements of that situation. And the relationship between cognition and context is a reflexive relationship. Context is not a box that has action-independent meaning. Other terms that I would like to mention here already are artifacts, the material and immaterial objects that humans develop or to which we allocate specific functions like tools, instruments, techniques, technologies. Also, of course, embodiment, the bodily grounding of comprehension, also language comprehension. Then affordances that I think I used before, the idea that we do not perceive objective universal characteristics of the objects in our surroundings, but rather we perceive what the object enables us to do in that situation. And that again might be different for different people in that same situation. So, and that term was coined by the psychologist James Gibson in the 1960s already. Then there is the concept of scaffolding, referring to support systems and frameworks. It's like at a construction site. And this term stems from a social and cultural view of learning. So according to this situated cognition approach, one of the main reasons for our intelligence is the fact that we delegate knowledge to our environment and motions also. We use tools and instruments. So much of the complexity is scaffolded by external structures, and we reduce the need to store and search for and process knowledge in the brain. And this kind of cognitive scaffolding manifests itself in very many ways. Also in translation, we design translation offices and technologies to suit their specific purpose. We use specific forms of discourse in various conversations. We create checklists to coordinate action, and that way also reduce the cognitive load on our memory. The socio-cognitive approach to translational action brings the significance of artifacts to the fore. As mentioned, artifacts refer here to material and immaterial objects that we develop or which we allocate specific functions to. Because artifacts are seen as integral parts of socio-cognitive activity, we will have to ask, what is the significance of artifacts in translation? Do they just influence the process? Or do they help solving especially complex problems that are hard to solve otherwise? Or do they maybe amplify existing individual cognitive capacities like memory, visual perception, for example? Or do they change the nature of the socio-cognitive processes altogether? Is language the ultimate artifact? And if language is the ultimate artifact, human-made object, immaterial object, and in what sense is language an artifact? Is it empirically viable to assume a symmetry between humans and artifacts as agents in the socio-cognitive unit? Or are there reasons to insist on an asymmetry between humans and artifacts? From 4EA cognition viewpoint, we can see artifacts as part of the cognitive unit itself. They provide scaffolds, these reliable environmental properties that we can exploit and lean on to when we act. Of course, they can also hinder an activity. And from this point of view, artifacts are not necessarily or primarily amplifiers of any existing individual cognitive capacity, but rather they change the nature of the cognitive process. They reconfigure the cognitive space, as Lucy Suchman describes it, and they transform the whole cognitive unit, as Edwin Hudgens describes it. So introducing a specific artifact in a cognitive system potentially results in a different set of components and their relationships, and thus in a different system dynamics altogether. For example, in that empirical study on freelance translation that I mentioned, I studied the cognitive processes as interaction with the environment, and it was wonderful to be able to see how the translator exploited environmental affordances to remember, to organize herself and others, and to evaluate decisions. So, for example, as resources, she used online dictionaries, online parallel texts, prior translators she had written herself, and she wrote down terms on a piece of paper. She moved the cursor back and forth, up and down, to organize herself, and she mumbled translated paragraphs half loud to herself. So in a way, she externalized parts of the process and transformed the internal processing into an interaction with self-produced outer stimuli. And I think this was really a prototypical example of extended cognition. Finally, the socio-cognitive approach to translational action poses the big question of the role and significance of representation. Representation is the idea that sensory perceptions are related to stored mental images of some kind or units of some kind in order to understand what we perceive. Does it make sense to assume items with representational functions in the head or in the situation of activity to explain translation? Does it make sense to assume internal mental representations in the head? And if so, which role should we allocate for internal and mental representations? Do we also or exclusively need to assume extra individual representations beyond the brain? For example, artifacts with representational function. Does language have a representational function? And if so, how does it do it? And do translations represent the source texts? And if they do that, how do they do it? Regarding the role of representations of all these questions, there's a lively cognitive scientific discussion going on, and the spectrum of answers includes, for example, strongly representational views like the propositional theory of mind, cognition as symbol manipulation, and also more moderate assumptions of action-oriented internal representations. Then there are radical non-representational embodied cognitive positions such as Kemero's position, for example, and the distributed view on mental and material representations of Edwin Hutchins that I have included as part of the socio-cognitive approach, my approach to explaining translation. In this approach, we can understand representations to reside both inside and outside the brain. So also gestures, facial expressions, speech and tools and visuals, space, body orientation, other structures, they can be representations on which the cognitive process unfolds. We use artifacts as representations that facilitate memory, coordination, and communication. And this generation and manipulation and transformation of these external representations is an integral part of cognition, internal and external representations. So external representations can provide relatively stable structures that can be shared, and so they facilitate the orientation of the socio-cognitive system. So how might these theoretical constructs that I mentioned, context, artifacts, embodiment, affordances, scaffolds, how can they be operationalized for empirical studies? And what kind of methodological tools, approaches would you use? In research on translation, you could focus, for example, on how translation agencies translate texts with all their project managers, in-house and freelance translators, revisers, clients, language technology tools, other technical and communication resources. Also, how texts emerge as products of the publisher, its networks, guidelines, and processes that could be literary translations or other translations. Also, how technological infrastructures and human contributors in digital translation platforms produce translations. I think there are some examples of all these views, for example, in the PhD studies that will be presented in this summer school. But in any case, all these examples of complex networks as cognitive units are kind of translation-related examples of these tight webs of interrelationships that are, as Hutchins calls them, typical of real-world cognitive ecologies. Methodologically, scholars are paying attention to the embeddedness of cognition and might stress observing actors in their natural environments, giving careful attention to macro and micro structures of interaction, for example, through ethnographic and participant observation. I think this kind of field research is on translation and interpreting is really a part of a wider shift in translation studies towards also focus on rich and situated activities and interactions at all levels of situations, also of organizations and of societies. So one would choose a social network, a workplace, or other larger unit as the empirical setting of analysis of the joint dynamics of this overall system. And when it comes to the study of translation and cognition, I see cognitive ethnography as a particularly productive line of research. Cognitive ethnography looks at how people create meanings, also in group and organizational or institutional activities. By using this cognitive ethnography approach, we can examine how the technical, material, and social structures and resources are employed in translation and interpreting. In the field, we can study how the tools and the space in which translators work shape their cognitive processes. For instance, how the workspace, the colleagues, the tools become parts of the translators or interpreters' cognitive processes. And we can look at the actors and their common situation as a shared space, a common experience, or even as one cognitive system. We can investigate, for example, how remote simultaneous interpreters exploit their environmental cues to navigate in that digital environment. So this alignment or connection with others and with technology can be either, of course, helpful or irritating or even disruptive to the activity. Of course, also the lab shapes the cognitive process. In the lab, we can study how the cognitive processes are aligned and coupled with the social and material resources that the laboratory provides, depending on what kind of technical and social scaffolds it offers. Also, in different fields of translation and interpreting, we can, and I think we should, look at the discourse on translation and interpreting. How do practitioners and other actors describe and evaluate translation? Which labels are used to refer to different roles, and what do these labels say about the roles and the understanding of translation and interpreting? Okay, this is my to-do list. In any case, I think there are good reasons for trying to find a balance between theoretical and empirical research. Future theoretical research could try to refine the theoretical constructs underpinning translation process research and cognitive translation and interpreting research, and to make them more compatible with theoretical developments in cognitive science. This would be helpful in the development of comprehensive models of the translation process. Of course, you might say it's unrealistic to focus research efforts on modeling the whole process, the whole translation or interpreting process, when even a single empirical study of a specific aspect of the process often requires large-scale research projects. But I think being able to sketch a comprehensive model of the translation process would help avoiding reductionist or simplistic views of the complex process of translation and interpreting. So, and of course, it would help us to more fully understand the complexity of the process. Thank you so much. There's some literature that I have used in my talk.
Thank you so much, Professor Risku. What an enriching what an enrichment to the CETRA's cognitive system. I'm sure there's questions. You have captivated the audience, which is how we've gone 8 minutes over time. But if it's all right with everyone, let's take some time for discussion, and if anyone has any burning questions, now would be the time to ask them. Any questions for our chair professor after this first inspiring lecture? You can go ahead and just activate your microphone and speak up. We don't need to raise hands unless there's.
Do you think we will need the slides? Shall I stop sharing the screen, or?
I think you can probably stop sharing. Yeah, and we can. You're spotlighted now, so we all see you large anyway. But
okay.
While we're thinking about questions, I did have one very sort of broad question, and if I follow the premise, it is that consistent infrastructure is from the various systems, as social, biological, consistent infrastructures enable dynamic translatorial action. Mm-hmm. So you need to have a stable system or a set of systems in order to act dynamically. But what happens when those systems are no longer stable in the situation of traumatic change or war or refugee context? Mm-hmm. How does cognitive translation process research deal with unstable systems?
Thank you for this really, really interesting question. I think it's not really necessary that the environment stays stable, but I think that what we strive for very often in order to stabilize the quality and the process that we carry out is that we automatically and unconsciously keep on creating environments and infrastructural systems. So that's just in the nature, seems to be in the nature of human thinking, that we kind of think with our hands in that sense, that we rely on the environment. And I don't think it's necessary to actually have a stable environment in order to act in a sensible way in translation and interpreting. But I think we have to know that the environment is such an important part of the process, and it really makes a difference. And if you are a translation agency CEO, or you are a freelance translator and so on, I think it's so important to think about that infrastructural and social dimension of individual acting.
Thank you very much. Sara Ramos Pinto, question?
Thank you very much, Hanna. It was really interesting, your talk, and I fully agree with your approach to translation, and I'm very much in the same line, even though coming from sociosemiotics, multimodality, it's all about situatedness of meaning making and so on. But I would like to know what you think about a problem that I keep encountering, is that the more I situate, and a problem for us researchers, the more we situate translation process, the more we also individualize the issues, the more they become elements of the process that are specific to that translator or to that viewer or reader. So how can we deal with that individual nature. And I keep encountering this problem because we need to deal with concepts such as audience, which at the same time are fully logical and needed, but at the same time, they go counter our argument that each person will have their own environment, will have their own, be situated, will receive in a different way, the same way that the translator will have its own environment and produce differently because of that environment. So how can we deal with both this need to generalize and to deal with concepts and big groups and systems, but also with how situatedness and localizing in time and space leads us to this individual that we cannot in practice deal with?
Mm-hmm. A huge methodological question. I think what you highlight here is actually something that, of course, all people doing qualitative research and workplace research, field research of that kind have to manage. And for me, the solution is that I'm only carrying one part of translation studies and interpreting studies research, and I'm not the one who's supposed to answer all the questions. So we need both quantitative and qualitative research, people who look at very, very closely at these specific individual situations and describe them in detail and show what is possible, because already that might falsify a hypothesis. If there's a general hypothesis, and then I can show one case which exactly corresponds to that hypothesis and doesn't confirm the hypothesis. So it's extremely important, and we can get new insights, new hypotheses, new understanding on the processes. And of course, we also need quantitative research that can try to abstract from the specific situations and look at very specific aspects, hypothesis-based, and not trying to maybe invent new factors, but rather control the factors. So I think it's a cooperation inside translation studies too, and both of the approaches have their merits.
Thank you.
Imren, you had a question? And then Philippa and David.
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Professor. I find your lecture very relevant to my study, actually, because I've been studying reception from a social psychological perspective. So I'm very interested in the meaning-making processes. And I have two questions for you. The first one is about context that you thought that you described as action dependent, right? Mm-hmm. What kind of action are we talking about here? Is interaction and communication included to create that context? The first one is this. And the second one, you also mentioned that focus in the cognitive studies has been in the production process instead of the reception process, and also related to that translators are now creative producers rather than neutral objective professionals, right? If we look at all this production process from the reception view and merging it with the meaning making and the socio-cognitive processes, social psychology, wouldn't be, or do you think we could understand this production process better?
Oh, okay. Let me deal with the first question first. Yes, deal with context. That with context in that case, I really mean both the textual, but also material and social context. So that would certainly, the action dependence would depend on whatever the person that whose acting is dealing with at that moment. So that would be maybe writing something, doing research, social interaction, communication. I think that would include the description that you gave. And during the activity, of course, we not only relate to the context, but we also produce the context by and choose it by bodily interactions and changes in the environment. So in that sense, yes, both activities with artifacts and social interaction too. I'm not quite sure if I can answer your second question, but I think at least I can say that I think it's extremely important to look at translation also from this participatory view of that has been already introduced in translation studies, participatory translation studies, because here the question is both how do people produce translations and anticipate the reader's understanding of the texts, of their texts, and if we could just somehow try to include that anticipation in a systematic way into the translation process. So it's just that not just hoping that people will understand, but actually systematically trying to manage that understanding. So I think reception as a process dealing with that one is very, very important in translation studies, and in the process research field, it has not been done very much, but of course you can use the same theoretical background for studying both production and reception.
Thank you.
Philippa?
Hello. I have to apologize for running around. I have some children in the background, so I'm juggling a few things this morning. But first of all, thank you very much for your fascinating lecture. My question might actually be a little bit too specific to my project, but I'll ask it anyway. I was absolutely fascinated because in my actual research project, I am looking at the production of translation, so in the context of a journal. But obviously within the cognitive process, it's about the observational part, which I don't have because I'm not observing the translation process as it's been going on because it's already happened in the past. And I was just wondering, can you still, because I'm going to be conducting interviews as well, I was just wondering if it's still possible then to draw on the cognitive part, although I don't have that, I'm not actually observing the translation in practice. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. Actually, in one of the studies, the one that I mentioned as a prototypical example of extended cognition, I carried out retrospective interviews with the translator and her client, and I also observed the translator translating. But on the client side, for example, I, of course, it didn't make sense, would not have been empirically viable to observe his dealing with this translation process and providing terminology and so on, because it just happens as a tiny little piece of his other work. But I think interviews are extremely an important source of information and data, and if you combine it with textual analysis of texts and maybe other objects that have been produced in that process during drafts and so on, revisions, whatnot. So I think the combination, that kind of mixed methods idea, works well. And of course, when you carry out interviews, I think you just need to decide very consciously what kind of interviews are there and what is the validity of those interviews. How much of the actual process can the persons actually remember? We know that memory changes with time. So is your interview right afterwards, or is it like 50 years after writing that translation, which would still make sense? But as long as you know what might have happened in between, and you know what the status of your data is in that case.
Thank you very much.
David?
Yes, hello. As I mentioned earlier, I'm studying translation in the Catholic Church, which is an unusual context. And one of the things that impinges quite significantly on what you were talking about agency is that translation in the Catholic Church is probably one of the last places where translators are completely and utterly anonymous. And so the agency is very much the institution as a conceptual sort of body that produces translations, and the actual input of each individual translator is largely unknown. But even if by some miracle the person could be identified, I think that their individual agency as a person would be far less important than the overall agency of the institution. So I just wondered if your particular approach would be able to encompass that. And then also the other thing I noticed is you talked about culture, the importance of the target culture. And again, in the Catholic Church, the notion of culture can't ignore religion. And that's something that we tend to keep very separate from our understanding of culture in translation studies. But there are conceptualizations of culture that would not want to ignore any sort of philosophical religious dimension to such an extent that culture would have no meaning without that aspect. So again, I just wondered if that was something that could be incorporated into your approach.
Yeah, sounds really inspiring for me too, to think about that specific your case, because I think just with my naive layperson understanding of the situation in which these texts have been translated, actually the institutional infrastructure, the social infrastructure is extremely important, and the translation is very much constrained. When I say constrained and institutional, I would like to add that many of the areas in translation in which we think that translation is kind of free creation might be extremely constrained, like transcreation, writing marketing texts. They might be extremely constrained. It's only certain colors and words and structures and so on that you are supposed to use in the translation. So I think your case that you are studying, the data that you are studying, is extremely institutionally constrained, like some other areas in translation too. And yes, when you say that culture includes religion and is often not mentioned, at least. Yes, I'm sure it does. And when you look at the concept of culture as it is used in translation studies today, I think when you think of societal cultures and subcultures and subcultures, maybe also the institutional structures of the Catholic Church can be seen as a culture, as one culture. So it's a very complex relationship, actually.
Thank you.
Do you have anything to add, David, or are you satisfied with this answer?
Well, there aren't many translation studies scholars who've addressed the issue of Catholic liturgical translation. It just doesn't enter into their radar. But there was a short piece that was written by Anthony Pym about 10 years ago, and he tries to shoehorn the Catholic approach to liturgical translation into the familiar models of cultural approaches to translation studies. So he tries to argue that the current approach is based on promoting what he calls Catholic culture. But if you analyze that in more detail, it's something that doesn't really work. I could go into it in more detail, but there isn't time. But the basic point is that I think that translation studies scholars tend to think of culture as the ultimate ontological explanation for reality, whereas the Catholic Church would accept that to a point, but it would want to expand the definition of culture. And then that becomes quite controversial to some people because it makes culture seem like each individual culture has this individual take on some sort of meta-ontology, and human beings are all united in their common relationship to God. And so you get into more ontological discussions, because where does that leave people who don't believe in God? Are they some sort of lesser human being because of that fact? So
do you agree that culture is the ultimate ontological category? Does that fit with your framework? And then I'm afraid we have to move on to the last question. But maybe you have a response to that. What is the main ontological category for a sociocultural process research?
Are you asking me, Jack?
Yeah. What's your response?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's interesting. In our research group, we have been thinking about what is it that for our research group, including different research projects and PhDs and so on, what is the fact that actually, or the ontological thing that somehow combines we all share? And we thought of interaction. So maybe it's more interaction, a more dynamic understanding. But of course, it depends on how you define culture. So it's not really possible to say it is that or is it not, as long as you have not defined culture. And we know that culture is so difficult to define. But what I actually wanted to address also, as you mentioned, individual agency. As far as I know, especially in Bible translation, for example, they are not today, when new Bible translations are produced, it's not one person, of course, that is doing it, but they are theologists and translation studies people, linguistic people, historians, and so on, and they work as a group. So even in that sense, in religious translation, the individual agency is very strongly reduced, both institutionally and socially, but also in that group framework.
Okay, we'll continue the discussion. Elsewhere, Lin Chen, you have the honor of the last question before we close our opening session.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Risku. But can you see me or hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
Yeah, but it seems that the camera is not working. Oh, I'm sorry. It bumped up in my iPhone, so I need to cut off the technology. All right, now you can see me. Okay, thank you very much for the wonderful talk. It's very inspiring. Actually, I'm not in the field of process research, but so my interest is mainly about later translation and the translator study. So I'm also quite interested in agency and human behaviors. During my research, I found that it more or less also gets relevant to like applied model of human mind and human cognition, because I need to study like the ideas of translators and like poetical views or tendencies or their value systems, which are all connected to conscious. And so I have, you correct me if I'm wrong, but I am in the view that maybe the human cognition can be divided into like conscious cognition, which is more reflective, related to like strategies that we are aware of, right? And then there is this element. I think it's a large portion, which is the unconsciousness, right? Like unconscious cognition, like motivations and like inclinations and the tendencies of interactive patterns in social cultural contexts, which for most of the time that the actors are not aware of. So I wonder, because you have proposed like the 4 EAs and all sorts of the models, which are really fascinating about cognition. So if you can, if we can look at the model or the line of thinking from the perspectives of like the at least dual part, elements of unconsciousness and consciousness in human cognition. Mm-hmm. So what are your observations in your research that what are the different roles played by the different parts of human mind in actual like the interactions and the behaviors of the professional translators? Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for the question. I think from modern cognitive science, there would be, for example, this model of slow and fast translation that in part also corresponds to what you say, conscious and unconscious cognitive processes. And I think that the 4EA cognition approach would certainly stress the unconscious processes, especially because the former approaches have stressed and emphasized the conscious processes in such to such an extent. And I would also say that I think what is important to understand in that model is that in the socio-cognitive or extended model, 4EA model, that there are no conscious processes without the unconscious ones. So they also always play, it's always an interplay. And also there are no unconscious processes that would not have been influenced by the conscious ones. So you can't separate them in that to that extent that you would say, I'm only studying these or that, or here we can see only conscious processes or whatever. So I think that's something that one would keep in mind dealing with this consciousness problem of cognition.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, wonderful. It bodes well that we're 38 minutes beyond the original time for the rest of our summer school. This format is also tends to be heavy on the cognitive load. Thank you for joining us for what has become 2 hours of a wonderful opening session. Thank you to our chair professor Hanna Risku for a very inspiring first talk, and thank you to the interveners for their questions. This concludes our first session. Thank you for being here. We will reconvene live for the participants tomorrow with the Q&A of Frans Poacher's webinar, and then we'll also convene at 10:30 for the second chair professor's lecture, or the second lecture by the chair professor. And just so you know, we are recording these for the participants, and they'll be made available, including, I think, the transcript, interestingly, if that's okay with the chair professor, on the Toledo platform. So for the participants, you'll have access to the recordings as well. We'll leave it there. Thank you all, and see you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thanks very
Thank
much.
you.